You have meddled with the primal forces of nature, Mr. Beale, and I won't have it. Is that clear? You think you merely stopped a business deal? That is not the case. The Arabs have taken billions of dollars out of this country, and now they must put it back. It is ebb and flow, tidal gravity. It is ecological balance. You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, Rins, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today. That is the atomic and subatomic and galactic structure of things today. And you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. What do you think the Russians talk about in their councils of state? Karl Marx? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, Minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments, just like we do. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business. The world is a business, Mr. Beale. It has been since man crawled out of the slime. And our children will live, Mr. Beale, to see that perfect world in which there's no war or famine, oppression or brutality. One vast and ecumenical holding company for whom all men will work to serve a common profit, in which all men will hold a share of stock, all necessities provided, all anxieties tranquilized, all boredom amused. And I have chosen you, Mr. Beale, to preach this evangel.
Why me?
Because you're on television, dummy. 60 million people watch you every night of the week, Monday through Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr. Beale.
we're back, finally, after all this time. And, Buongiorno, just want to apologize for, this kind of delay between the lectures. And it was due to a lot of different things. It was due to, juggling and the whole production method of getting these up online and grading papers. And, I've been confronted with a lot of the same difficulties you guys have in terms of getting around and all that. So my apologies for that. But hopefully, you watched the first 2 episodes of Century of the South. That was an assignment. And it would have stood in for, I would have probably showed them in class anyway. So that time is, just consider that lecture time, because we would probably at least watch episode 1 and probably episode 2, which is what I usually do when I've done the documentary. There's a lot going on in it, and I think that just having you watch it is not enough. I mean, certainly it needs to be unpacked. It needs to be given context, and I think that we're going to find that what Adam Curtis has to say in this documentary series is very much connected with what Berger has to say and ways of seeing, and specifically, even things that Sontag has to say about photography and what Debord says about the Society of the Spectacle, but it all kind of ties back to our overarching allegory of the Matrix, in terms of the ways in which certain types of specifically visual technologies have been utilized to, fleece us or control us or bamboozle us, bamboozle, I love that word, into behaving a certain way and coercing us into doing things. And that this has a lot, and with Curtis, as with some of our other thinkers that we've explored, this has a very, very long history. It has a long history, and there's places where, for instance, Debord and Curtis totally link up, and where they are divided about certain things. So we're going to go over Century of the South. We're going to go over episode 1 today, which was called Happiness Machines. And hopefully you got my email from yesterday giving the post to episodes 3 and 4. Once again, I think it's a series that you need to watch, you need to watch it, not unlike Berger's Ways of Seeing documentary. You have to watch it all, and you have to watch it in order, because I think that just like Berger is attempting to build an argument, a thesis about the ways in which art and the visual arts and photography were ultimately utilized in publicity, Curtis is going to build a case not antithetical about the ways in which this happens in the 20th century. He concentrates primarily on the 20th century. So we're going to dig into that. But before I do, I definitely want to talk about the prospect of final projects and or papers, okay? And I've done a lot of soul searching about this. And after everything is said and done, we've all just been kind of through the ringer. I accept that, and making this transition into an online forum was grueling in a lot of ways, and the decision-making process, but I think that the decisions that I've made have been pretty sound as far as doing these, as videos and having guest speakers and all that. But as far as the final projects, I just want to give everybody kind of a break, alright, in terms of the amount of work that I'm expecting out of you for a final project, just due to the sheer conditions of where you guys are situated right now, and basically, you know, for all intents and purposes, I can just say it's like I'm kind of burnt out over the whole process, so that I'm gonna go easy with these projects. You know, I would like to see something, you know, but basically, I'm gonna leave it up to you what you want to do with this. All right. It's like I've always said, and for this course, it's always held up that the final project was always either, if you're not a presentation person, then you can do a paper, all right? But I'm not. It's like, here's the things that I've cut back on, all right? Just so you know the break that I'm giving you, right? You know, usually I'm looking for a 5 to 7 page paper, a 5 to 10 page paper as a final project, something of that magnitude. It's like I'm looking for something. All things considered, I'm looking for something 3 to 5 pages. 3 to 5 pages, and if you want to go beyond that, that would be your choice. But keeping the page counts down, but at the same time, you know, making it something thoughtful. You know, making it something thoughtful, or going as far as giving you the option of doing like a 2-page paper with PowerPoint slides. Like that's what you would submit, like PowerPoint slides, you know, making your presentation, and then a 2-page paper as an accompaniment, all right? And then option 3, which a lot of people love, you know, if you've got the setup for it, is like just doing it as a video, doing it as like a 10-minute video with PowerPoints, you know, something along what I'm doing now, but only for like 10 to 20 minutes, you know. So those would be the options, you know, as far as the format. All right, and let's figure the due date is going to be like the last day of classes. All right, to get it up, there'll be a thread to upload everything, and we'll call it a day. We'll call it a day at that point. So, you know, I mean, I was just like torn, you know, in a lot of different ways about, you know, what, you know, I didn't think we could just like just totally call it a wash and say like we're not doing a final project, because I don't think that would be fair to you, you know, in a pedagogical sense of like, you know, of you having an opportunity to, you know, be challenged or challenge yourself in some way to put something together, you know. So that will be an email in terms of the format. So the takeaway with that is you're gonna have a lot of latitude in what you want to do, all right? And you're gonna, in terms of the format, you're also gonna have a lot of latitude in what you want to do as an idea, as a proposal, all right? And I'm open to proposals that are very wide, you know. But ultimately, it's always like, well, what do you want? What do you want us to do? What do you want me to do? And I'm always kind of like, well, you know, considering like the overall conceptual framework of the class, you know, the project should have something to do with media, with visual media, either photography or art or television or advertising, and should speak to some of the ideas that we've unpacked in terms of the ways in which, and even social media. Social media is totally fair game. And everything, and anything from like data surveillance to artificial intelligence to representations of certain, you know, maybe somebody wants to do something on, you know, society of the spectacle and, you know, the way the media has represented the pandemic, you know, or, you know, effects of social media. You know, maybe do something about, you know, and this could even be a survey. This could be even be like something like, say you're really, really interested in like maybe, you know, we did some things about abstract art, and I'm kind of interested in that. Maybe, you know, I want to do a paper on, you know, the evolution of abstract art during the age of photography, the initial age of photography. You know, maybe concentrate on, you know, or maybe dig deeper into one person. You know, for instance, you might want to do a paper on Debord and the Situationist, and maybe read some other stuff that Debord wrote, because Debord would write a sequel to Society of the Spectacle in 1989 called Comments on the Society of the Spectacle. You could do a film analysis. For instance, let's say there's a lot of films out there like The Matrix, all right? And in the sense that their overall narrative, their allegory is kind of, influenced by The Matrix, or there's even, films that kind of predate The Matrix that talk about the ways in which, kind of sci-fi type films that talk about these dystopian visions of the way that people, 1984, the book and the film are both, fair game. It's like, in a sense that, George Orwell's book 1984 was the seed of, and we see references in The Matrix. To remember, we see references to 1984 in The Matrix from 101 and all that. So you might want to do like a comparative essay or a comparative presentation about something, maybe something I don't know about. Maybe there's something out there that, you Generation Y people are like plugged into, that you can be like, Buongiorno, this is like really a lot like The Matrix, and make a case for it, Somebody did a really interesting project I think it was last semester, about, he did a presentation arguing The Matrix from the side of Agent Smith, from the side, making a case for Agent Smith and The Matrix being in the right, like them being the good guys, and it was pretty good. He made a pretty good case for it. Stuff like that, little mind trips like that, But I know that you're going to have a lot on your plate, so I'm not looking for this huge Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey circus of a presentation. I'm looking for something boom, 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 some interesting ideas, and let's call it a day. All right, you can take it where you want. I know some of you, like me, are plagued with some ambition. You might want to, do something extensive. Maybe your presentation will be a little longer than 10 minutes. Maybe you'll want to bring in videos. Maybe you want to bring in links. I'm totally open to whatever you guys want to do with this, but we need to do something, And so we got 2 weeks, So I want to make sure that we're on point with where we want to be in terms of an overall project. And for those of you, and I guess it's all kind of dictated too on whether you've been it's like, if everything else checks out, I'm going to just be totally honest with it. If your midterm paper was good, if your comments were good, you commented on the blogs, the other stuff all kind of checks out, then the onus is kind of off. It's like, if you want to skimp, God forgive me for saying it, but if you want to skimp a little bit on the project and do something kind of manageable, that's up to you. Having said that, if you've just dropped the ball on every other aspect of the class, you might want to, kind of roll your sleeves up and, put something together that I'm going to be like, cool, It depends, it depends on a lot of factors, which road you want to take in regards to a project. But if you're having problems coming up with something, I'm going to submit, let's do a phone conference. Let's do a phone conference sometime within the next 4 to 5 days. Say, email me, Mr. B. It's like, I don't know what I want to do. Let's get on the phone and parlay with it. It's like, that's what I would do during my office hours, is, kind of brainstorm. The one thing I absolutely insist on is that you do not do something that you don't, or you're not interested in, and that you just don't want to do. Don't turn it into a job. You know, turn it into something that you want to know about, you want to know more about, or turn it into something you know a whole heck of a lot about, and you want to kind of convey that. You want to convey that, you know, and you know, when you upload them, they should be there for other people, for other members of the class to see, because under normal circumstances, you would be doing your presentation to the class. So we should, you know, I'm not going to say comment on the stuff because it's a timing thing, but, you know, you should make your stuff available for comment, you know, on Blackboard up until like grade time. It's like, you know, and I'll look at it too, you know, so, you know, let's say like, you know, if you have input, let's say like, okay, it's due the 19th, grades are due on whenever, 2 days later. If you want to, you know, comment on somebody else's stuff, you know, as I'm like, you know, collating your game and I'm looking at the blog, it's like, you know, if you have comments that are like cool and stuff like that, I'm going to be like, wow, this guy, like, you know, this girl was, you know, kind of taking the extra step. Although it's not going to be essential that you do that, you know. But, you know, it's like, you know, it's like, you know, my feeling about the whole thing is like, I'm always a stickler about people like when we would have days where we would do presentations. It's like, it's just a foregone conclusion that, you know, in a brick and mortar setting that you would show up, even if you weren't presenting that day, because, you know, it was told to me, you know, that you need to support your peers. You know, if somebody puts something together, you know, it's like they want an audience. They want people to see it. You know, so you know, I would strongly suggest that, you know, looking at the papers and looking at stuff and making some comments in that last minute, you know, just to see just to kind of, you know, get a sense of what other people are doing, you know, because the other thing that I usually do that we're not going to do is I usually have a session right about now, like on this date, you know, where we would just go round robin and people would like come up with proposals and the rest of the class could like put input in, maybe you should check something like this out. Unfortunately, we can't do that. The timing is off. You know, I mean, you know, there's things we can do and there's things we can't do. So I think I've done, you know, and just remember, you know, it's like just, you know, I just did a slide talking about just a recap of some of the things that we talked about: art, photography, film, The Matrix, the film in which I unpacked it, and we've used The Matrix throughout the class. I think it was an applicable metaphor for, you know, a lot of the other things. I think my thinking is sound with that. John Berger's Ways of Seeing, you know, Susan Sontag's essay on photography in Plato's Cave, Andre Bazin, the ontology of the photographic film, and Peter Benson's response to Bazin and Sontag about, you know, the nature of digital photography, Guy Debord, the Society of the Spectacle, might want to do something on that, and then things come full circle with Adam Curtis, Century of the Self. So, you know, it's like, don't spend a lot of time racking your brain about what you're going to do. You know, just, you know, think about something. If you need to, like, shoot me a quick email for me to, like, vet it. You know, I kind of would like to vet it. You know, it's like, email me and just give me a few sentences, like, I want to do blah, blah, blah. You know, and then I can be like, and at least I can feel like I'm being useful in some way. You know, that's what it's all about. And I can shoot back to you with like, well, maybe you want to check out this, or maybe you should do this, or maybe you should make it a little smaller. You know, because one of the greatest errors of like student work is they want to do something about life, the universe, and like, you know, nowadays it's like when somebody comes up to me and it's like, I want to do something about the negative effects of social media. I'm just like, yeah, okay, whatever. You know, it's just like, it's too broad. it's too broad, and there's been so much work done in very specific ways about what social media is doing to the culture, blah blah blah. That you need to like narrow stuff down, or somebody. I want to do something about photography, what does that tell me? You need to be able to narrow down a thesis, and be specific. All right, so. Having said all that, let's dig into Adam Curtis's documentary. For those of you who have watched it, it might have left you baffled. It might have left you a little bit shaken. There's a lot going on. And like a former professor of mine used to say about certain kind of documentaries, it can be exhausting. It can be exhausting in terms of the sheer amount of information that he imparts in like 4 hours, and it's been kind of a challenge for me to I used to just kind of skim over the whole thing, I did it for a documentary class and we watched it and I did like one lecture, but to break it apart, to break the arguments apart piece by piece to see where he's going, that is a challenge, and it was a challenge for me to put this together. Very opening of the film, right? He kind of it's in a lot of ways it takes the form of a novel or not a novel but a book or an essay, and that it is attempting to make an argument about something. It's tempting to in any good essay. In any good rhetorical argument, whether it be a documentary or whether it be a book, usually early on it's like the artist or the author will let you know what this thing is about. And the beginning of the film is he basically says, and that's him during the entire voiceover, with his inimitable. He's got a great voice. He's got that great British voice, but he says, 100 years ago, a new theory about human nature was put forward by Sigmund Freud. He had discovered, he said, primitive sexual and aggressive forces hidden deep inside the minds of all human beings. Forces which, if not controlled, led individuals and society to chaos and destruction. This series is about how those in power have used Freud's theories to try to control the dangerous crowd in the age of democracy. So this is the theme. This is the theme, and this is where he's going to go. And, in order for us to talk about that, and we've already, in the early lectures, we kind of unpacked Freud a little bit, and at least enough for us to understand some of his main ideas. And we do a lot of that too in Com 240. If you want to get a primer on a more kind of in-depth primer on the work of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, you might want to look at the lectures I did on psychoanalytic criticism, because I go and I do a more thorough unpacking of Freud and Jung in terms of their overall ideas, and we have to remember, a couple different things about Freud. Freud had this kind of this trinity of different forces in the psyche. And we talked about like the id being that part of us that was drive-based, that had to do with our instincts and sexual desire and aggressiveness and energy. But we also have to remember, and Berger writes about that, and Arthur Berger writes about that in the introduction of his book. By the way, if you haven't looked at the conversation that we had in Com 240 with Arthur Berger, you should check that out. It was a lot of fun. And it was worth checking out. But we have to remember something about the id. that Berger talks about, and also is common knowledge, that the id itself is not necessarily all negative, right? There is conclusive evidence to show that, the unconscious, Curtis makes a case in this film about the unconscious being that part of us that always has to be kept in check, always has to be tamed, always has to be controlled, However, it also tends to be that place within our psyche that is the seat of creation and creativity, So I'm going to make a case that Curtis operates, and I don't want to blame Curtis. I'm going to say that the powers involved operate with a very, very oversimplified view of what Freud was trying to say. That those who would ultimately read human nature within this model of the human being as being this savage that needs to be controlled. That's one limited aspect of Freud's overall work. Because we have to remember that Freud was a physician, and then we had the ego, this part of us that was somewhere, that workaday self, that conscious self, that reasonable person that we are, essentially, that we present to other people, that is socially constructed, that is a balance between the id and what we call the superego. What was the superego? The superego was the restraints. It was as Abraham Lincoln said, the angels of our higher nature that are our conscience, our sense of duty, this other part of our psychological dynamic that is able to, for instance, delay gratification, or want to do something that we know is not a very, very good idea, and decide against it. But that all of these different parts, especially the id and the superego, can go awry. They have this flip side to them. They have a dark side and they have a bad side. Remember, the superego, a person with too much superego could have all kinds of feelings of guilt and repression and remorse and just be non-functional, and the same thing with the id. If a person just lets their id run rampant, it's like we were talking and I was doing a psychoanalytical reading of for the other class, that film The Joker, in terms of the id, the ego, and the superego. Joaquin Phoenix, The Joker, and the way in which he was attempting all these what are called reaction formations to contain his id, and this battle that goes on, and the film really essentially is this battle that goes on in this man's psyche, and one part of it gains dominance, due to a series of events, so we have to take this whole presumption that everything that is in the unconscious is just this, devil's brew, just waiting to, it's we know that, we know a lot more about the unconscious than that. This series is really about the ways in which Freud's theories were appropriated, or misappropriated, or misapplied, and it's also about what the prevailing model of a human being is. It's when I use this term, what a model of a human being is, you have to understand, it's whatever our belief system is concerning what we are as individuals, as a species, or as a culture, what the prevailing ideas are about it, and we'll talk more about that. So that what we see ultimately throughout the series is this kind of tug of war, this struggle that goes on between progressive forces and between, much more, controlling and manipulative forces over what is the proper way of treating people. What is the proper way of going about politics? What is the proper way of going about just society in general? And it's always predicated on, what the majority conceives of as being the model of the human being. What we are, essentially. And we've seen this before. We've seen this one. This kind of spatial model of like what consciousness is in Freud's conception of the psyche. We have the conscious self. We have this like kind of area just kind of below the surface, where according to this particular slide, the superego and the ego kind of reside here in this pre-conscious self. That isn't necessarily always. People kind of, psychologists fight over that, theoretical psychologists and cultural theorists will like fight over that. And here's where the little old it is, down here in the unconscious, all right? And then this whole like not non-conscious like area. There's this whole idea going on, because the two main players and the two main characters in our first episode are not just Freud, but Freud's American nephew, Edward Bernays, who is, when we first are introduced to him, is a kind of low-level agent. He's an agent that the first mention of any of his prior vocational things is that he handles the great opera singer. He's a talent agent, really. He handles Enrico Caruso, the great Italian opera singer, but he also happens to be Sigmund Freud's nephew, right? His American nephew. He emigrated to America. Freud, if you've watched the episode, chose to stay in Europe for most of his life. Until very, very much near the end, he's Viennese, which means he was Austrian, and did most of his work in Austria. And with the approach of World War II, he will emigrate to the UK. All right, so that's kind of like a sidebar. But the two main characters, but Bernays will ultimately become the architect. I mean, one can make a case for him being the architect for this whole industry called public relations. All right, and his first book is called Propaganda, and we learn a lot about Bernays, and we learn about the way in which Bernays kind of co-opts his uncle's ideas in order to become an influencer not only in the corporate world but in politics. All right, and the effect of the effect of that influence, the effect of this model of the human being. Okay, so Bernays, there's an interview in the film with Bernays. So he was still. I think Curtis must have gotten footage. He uses a lot of found footage. All right, that's another piece of it we have to talk about. So I don't think that since Bernays died in '95, I don't think that Curtis directly there's an interview in there with Bernays. I think it's found footage because he passes in 1995. But once again, we need to make sure that we understand some things about Freud's overarching idea, because I think that Curtis does have a tendency to kind of oversimplify for the sake of for the sake of a film, like a lot of like what Freud was attempting to do. We're not talking about this a person that was just totally, had totally written off humanity. That he would die pretty bitter and pessimistic about our prospects as a species. But during the course of Freud's entire career, he was really attempting as a physician to heal people and to attempt to get people to be able to deal with this supposed repository of all these savage instincts. It's like, well, Arthur Berger, who we talked to last week, has to say in his book is that about, and we're talking specifically about psychoanalytic criticism. He says psychoanalytic criticism rests on the assumption that we are not always aware of all that is in our minds, and that often we are governed by forces and motivations beyond our consciousness. Freud's goal was a noble one, all right? This wasn't somebody that was attempting to ruin humanity. The ways in which his theories may or may not have been like oversimplified and misapplied is a different story. But he says Freud's goal was a noble one. He wished to rescue people from being dominated by their unconscious id forces, which often function in destructive ways. Freud summed this up in his famous statement, quote, where the id formerly was, their ego shall be. And we'll see throughout the course of episode 2, these attempts at psychoanalyzing people, so most of his theoretical work and his work as a physician was really struggling with this idea of like, how do we get people to act rationally, given what we know, So there'll be all these conflicting theories about how we get people to do this, predicated on this model, all right? We'll see other models throughout episode 1. Other models predicated on the idea that man is if man is given all the information and he's given the right circumstances and he's treated fairly and not manipulated, he has a tendency to be fairly reasonable. We will see that formulate as a governmental policy for this country right around the time of the Great Wall Street crash, and it will be this overarching model of man as rational creature, that can overcome his barbarous instincts, that can say no, that can delay gratification, that we'll see operative in, for instance, Franklin Delano Roosevelt's approach to his presidency, and we'll talk about that. So, Freud's one-time collaborator Jung also made important contributions. Check out the lectures in Com 240. I have a lot to say, especially in Part 3 on Carl Jung and his importance even today. His theories have been of interest to sociologists, historians, anthropologists, and critics of both elite literature and the mass media. So both those guys are like big guys. They're big guys. Very early on in Bernays' career, we find out, and this is just a quote right from Adam Curtis, that as part of the war effort, this is World War I, the United States government set up a Committee on Public Information, all right? When we read Committee on Public Information, it's safe to assume that this is a euphemism for smoke and mirrors, all right? A think tank that whose main raison d'etre is to keep things in check and only let you know what they want you to know. And Bernays was employed to promote America's war aims in the press, all right? So he immediately is being employed, by the Wilson administration to get people to kind of get on the same page, Americans to get on the same page, to go to war, and that he would be, enlisted in that. I don't know why I just did that. I went to the very end of these things, and now I got to go and find where we are. Maybe if I go to home, which is a good thing to do, and go back to where we were. He will take some of the things. Bernays will take some of the things that he uses in politics. And the corporations at that time, the corporations of the 20s and the early 30s will come to him. And what Curtis will say is that the masses, it's like corporations will start to see a lot of relevance in like Freud's ideas on mass behavior and want to be consulted in the ways in which people would buy their stuff, So they went to Bernays. So the masses would have their unconscious desires channeled ultimately, and this is a little bit down the road, into consumerism. And we've already talked in Berger, we've talked in the lead up to DeBoard about, and even Curtis will talk about how our society went from a kind of use value society where most people, the majority of people, just bought what they needed into a consumer-based desire society where you no longer just bought what you needed, you bought what you wanted, or more specifically, you bought what companies like cajoled you and convinced you that you wanted. And this, we've already been down this street. Due to this, because there had been this fear, remember, of overproduction, that we had this whole, very, very sophisticated, powerful infrastructure of manufacturing, and that there was this fear that once people had everything they needed, the market would be sated, and people wouldn't need it. People wouldn't be buying, and the money would not be coming in to the degree that it was. Hence, this idea of creating false desires, and we've seen it in Berger, we've seen it in DeBoard, but we want to talk here in regards to. So we know like what happened. Curtis will kind of take us a little deeper into how it happened, how they did what they did, And Bernays would be one of the main architects of this whole system of mass psychology to get people into buying stuff they didn't need, And and the big takeaway about that will be the idea that it wasn't just about making money. There was this overall psychological conception of keeping people, of babysitting people and keeping them docile. We talked about commodity fetishism and false consciousness. And that, if you were operating, if you were, a corporate executive manufacturing something, or if you were a head of state of a sovereign nation, or you're a person of some influence, the question would ultimately arise: how are we going to manage the people? That's what politics is about, and essentially that's what, economics is about. How do we, given what Bernays is telling us that his uncle Siggy has to say about human nature, how can we keep people docile and hypnotized and so that society won't be ripped apart? Because there was this they had numerous evidence early in the century of how barbaric we could be through World War One. Remember, World War One is like 1917, 1918. The world like basically nearly tears itself apart with numbers of fatalities that far dwarf anything we've seen, for instance, in the pandemic. That there was every reason to believe that human beings were on the point of self-extinction, so that it seemed for some that the only way to keep that under wraps was to keep them distracted. That with that philosophy of human nature being operative, and numerous examples of it playing out in the world, it would almost seem as if it would have been the correct response. It's like there was all the evidence there that. Given when push comes to shove, we have a tendency to just start, killing each other in mass numbers. So from the political side, it was about stability and management, and making sure that things didn't go off the rails, right? This quiescent public that wasn't going to revolt, against, and we'll see the reasons why this happened, and we've already talked about it. One of the first, so Bernays makes this transition from politics. He goes, remember, with Woodrow Wilson to the peace treaties in Europe, in Paris, and he comes back. You gotta check the time here, folks. And he comes back, and he's already become kind of an influencer. He's become a name in politics. He was with Wilson during the whole, peace treaty negotiations, and Wilson's 12-point plan that you learn about in history, and his proposal for a League of Nations that kind of fell apart at that point. The next industry that approaches Bernays is the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry at this point, you got to remember, we're talking about like 1920, the early 20s, and it is still the cultural mores of the time. It's like were that ladies, if you were a lady, women didn't smoke, or they weren't supposed to. That cigarettes were something that men did, and that if it's like, I'm sure that women smoked, but in small numbers, because they were kind of ostracized in the same way, for instance, that there were stigmas for most of American history about tattoos, in that same way. Tattoos only became like this huge thing in like the last couple of decades. I remember coming up at a time when, if you had a tattoo, it's like coming up. It's like I only knew this one guy when I was like 7, 8 years old, that lived across the street from my grandmother that had a tattoo, and he had been in the Navy, and he was like, but that, in the same way that, and the tobacco industry was like, listen, we're losing half our market. What can you do for us to open up that market and make women smoking socially acceptable? And the first thing Bernays does is he doesn't go to his uncle because he says, it's like they ask him, like, why didn't you? He goes to a guy by the name of J.J. Brill. Brill was one of the Brill had been a student of Freud and was a psychoanalyst in the United States, and Bernays goes to Brill and he's like, what can we do? And Curtis stresses, for a large fee, Brill tells him that what cigarettes symbolize in psychoanalysis, and you got to remember, it's like psychoanalysis is really hung up a lot on the idea of symbolism, and that the cigarette, is a phallic symbol, which is just a nice way of saying it's this kind of symbol of the man's penis. And if you can convince women that it can be part of this kind of liberation, if you can incorporate it into women's equality and the women's liberation movement, they'll feel empowered. Because on the symbolic level, they'll feel like, now we're like men, And this gets into some deep areas of Freudian theory that we don't want to talk about right now, like penis envy in the women and the castration complex and all this that are ideas. But so that Bernays is already this, like, it's got this kind of, you know, finger on the pulse of the media and creating like media events. You know, he's one of the pioneers of what, you know, influencers now tend to do, you know, and public officials tend to do with, like, using the media, you know, to do what you want them to do. So that there was this big Easter parade in New York, and there was these debutantes being like women of privilege, young women of privilege, and he got them all to light up at the same time, and he called it torches of freedom. So there was this kind of complex psychological maneuver, and then the press went wild and covered it, and then after that, I mean, the floodgates were open with a little bit of sleight of hand and a little bit of psychoanalysis. It's like all of a sudden, like, the tobacco industry has got this whole new market, you know, this whole new market, and that will be, you know, for us, that will be an object lesson on the ways that these ideas will be utilized, you know, by the corporate world and by politics and by government. Different variations on this way of feeding one's unconscious desires and conception of oneself, you know. And there was this idea of like Lady Liberty, you know. So that we start to make this transition. We're still in a period in economic history where we have mass production, right? But remember what Curtis says, that you know, it's like manufacturing, whether it be clothes, cars, houses, everything is still, all of advertising up until this point, most of advertising, the goal of advertising, if it's anything, is just about, it's just like the whole idea of, I use this in, like, there was a show, Dragnet, this cop show back in the 50s, and these two guys used to say, like, the two cops used to go up to people and be like, just the facts, man, just the facts, man. It's like, but that advertising essentially was just about describing the object, how durable it was, you know what it was used for, and there was no extra stuff labeled on, because it was all, advertising was usually just connected with what people essentially needed. You know, if you needed, it's like, you know, what, it's like, you know, you didn't have to do all this sophistry, all this like sleight of hand to get people to go and buy a good pair of shoes or a car that, you know, was gonna like run, you know, but that there had been in the minds of the heads of corporations and the robber barons of that time that were manufacturing stuff, there was that overarching fear that it's like, once it's like, you know, it's like once the market gets filled, it's like we need, so that there's this whole idea of shifting over solely to keep the machine going and solely to continue to keep generating profits for the owners of the means of production. Marx rears his ugly head here again, his ugly furry head. The owners of the means of production need to find some type of psychological devices to get people to buy things above and beyond what they don't need, all right? And there will be this very, very sophisticated way of changing, and that one of the arguments that Curtis wants to make in the film is that ultimately what you do is you shift the very psyche of the American individual from being a worker to being a consumer, somebody that, you know, this whole idea of, and Curtis will keep playing on this idea that they were playing to people's selfishness, their desires, and creating a new kind of human being. Literally creating a new kind of human being that was no longer satisfied with just having the stuff that they needed, but wanted all this extra stuff. That's not to say that there wasn't a demographic of people that lived in that luxuriant world. It was called the ruling class. And we know from Berger, we know from DeBoer, how the ruling class so we moved from a needs economy into a desires-based economy. And in that shift in economy, there was also a shift in the human psyche of the mass of people. All right, that we're changing. Our psyche is changing in terms of how we view ourselves in society, and that's all being done by this apparatus of propaganda / public relations. It changes the psychic landscape of the human being. And Bernays is a wily one too. He's a crafty one because he, on top of everything else, starts to invent all kinds of stuff that we just take for granted nowadays. For instance, Curtis talks about the fact that he initially had started as a talent agent. So Bernays was handling some of the great Hollywood stars of the time, and the equivalent of whoever he was handling. Like Clara Bow was kind of like Clara Bow. I'm trying to think of a modern analogy, as a big Hollywood star. She would be like the oh God, I can't even think of anybody right now. Whoever the biggest whoever the biggest star is right now, it's she was like that. She was in fact, they called her the It Girl. They called her the It Girl, and he was handling her. So he started to understand how he could get, and he also invented product placement, and we talked about product placement. But to get the celebrities to go to places and go to these soirees and be out there with the paparazzi and be wearing hats by other companies that he handled. It's if I handled a fashion manufacturer, I was dressing up the celebrities that I handle with their stuff. And that this whole idea that we now call vertical integration, right? This whole idea of merchandising, merchandising a film or a new game, and all this these ideas of vertical integration were kind of like Bernays' idea, and so he'll get really, really wealthy. He'll get really wealthy to the point where he'll be kind of like the bon vivant man about town. He's with heads of state. He's with heads of industry, and he becomes a guy. He's like a guy. He's an influencer. So that this is all all of this consumerism is hinged on this concept of self-expression, right? This idea that you have these things inside you, and being able to kind of distinguish yourself from from other people, right? That you were this unique individual that was unique unto yourself with your own thoughts and ideas and imagination. You were this special guy or special lady, and that but you needed to but in order for other people so this whole game gets set up in which people are led to believe that in order for you to express your inner nature, you need to do it through what you were wearing or what you were doing or what you were buying primarily. That what you are is what it's this idea of self-expression comes about through what you're wearing. Are you wearing this year's fashions? Are you driving this year's car? Are you smoking this year's cigarette? It's all this idea of what was inside being on the outside had to do not with what you were inherently in terms of your ideas or your politics or who you were as this inalienable, creature worthy of dignity and respect just due to the fact that you're a human being, but you needed to express all that through stuff, so that we get what? We know what we get. We get commodity fetishism, we get envy, we get and we got to remember, boom, back to DeBoard, boom, back to Berger. How is the whole system set up? Glamour, envy, these jealousy, negative feelings, keeping up with the Joneses, all of that becomes equated in this sleight of hand with what you are as a human being, how you express yourself, and that the primary mode of expressing yourself would be through what you bought, and it was a conflation, right? It was a conflation that kind of won the day. This whole idea of self-expression through consumption. There was this famous aviator talking. Curtis quotes an unknown journalist at this point who says, 13 normals, a change has come over our democracy, this journalist says, at around this time. It is called consumptionism. The American citizen's first importance to his country is now no longer that of, quote, citizen, but that of consumer. That of consumer. And that journalists recognize this, right? And that this alliance that goes on between, and this is in everybody's interest, all right? It's in the interest of the state, and it's in the interest of corporations, all right? That will recognize these common interests they have. Here's the state thinking, wow, this is great for the economy. These people that we're kind of keeping people kind of, manageable through buying all this stuff, and, the corporate, it's just hand in glove. It was like a match made in heaven. And we're keeping them docile. But then, we have to remember that, all this is still being driven. It's not like every Tom, Dick, and Harry in this country, is like buying stuff. But there's a kind of privileged middle class who are buying all this stuff. A privileged upper, a middle, and an upper middle class that are the consumers. Because we still have, throughout this whole period, and this is even before the Depression, we still have like a majority of people that are just getting by. They're just getting by, and that can't afford all this stuff. And they're the ones that are making it. And this kind of middle ground, this kind of middle demographic that's buying all this stuff. And the higher up the food chain you are, the more stuff you can buy and the more you can express yourself. He, and this is Curtis talking again, Bernays, employed psychologists, right? Another strategy that Bernays uses. Another strategy that he comes up with. I mean, the guy was really, really, really crafty, and diabolical at the same time. I dare not call him a genius. I like to reserve the term genius for people that made the world a better place. Bernays, that's me doing that in quotes, employed psychologists to issue reports that said that products were good for you and then pretended that they were independent studies. They pretended that they were independent studies. So you got psychologists, he paid off psychologists to say, yeah, it's like, doing this, engaging in these kind of behaviors were good for you, and I had that photo there because, I'm doing this documentary on IBM, and I recently did you got to see this interview that I'm going to be putting up for Com 240 because we're doing a section on the interview. For a while, I had to study, about public relations, and how IBM and other companies kind of use all these different tactics. For instance, to keep dangerous chemicals on the market, and I spoke to Mike Shade, who was the public spokesperson for an activist group called Safer Chemicals Healthy Families, and we talked long and hard in that conversation about the history of how big businesses would fund and create their own supposed academic. They would get scientists to publish papers that would, for instance, minimize the carcinogenic effect of asbestos or lead paint. The lead paint industry, would get, and they would put out these essentially fucking phony scientific journals that were supposedly peer reviewed that involved a lot of hired guns, like hired scientists saying that, who were specifically told, it's like you've got to publish a paper or do an experiment that convinces people that smoking cigarettes isn't as bad as we thought, or whatever. It's like I bring it up because this becomes a practice that it becomes a common practice with corporations that are killing people and Bernays will be one of the pioneers in doing that, getting psychologists to write these scientific things about. So he's working for corporations. He's working to get, and once again, we have to understand the stresses on the idea of feeding the people's desires. Feeding your sense of selfishness. And we already understand the way in which sexuality plays into this. How it's like, and Bernays supposedly is attributed with being the first guy to start putting out automobiles as a sign of male sexuality and virility. That you could get, women would chase you with the right car, and all that. So that it's drawing on the drives, it's drawing on the instincts. At the same time, it's about how to manage society. He'll later, after this initial period, he'll be hired by presidents. The presidency of the United States. The next few presidents will be coming to him for advice. His clients will include the presidents of this country. And one of his first clients will be President Calvin Coolidge, who I guess kind of came off as a dry stick. He was considered just really kind of just boring. Boring, kind of uninteresting, kind of intellectual kind of guy that was a bureaucrat for all intents and purposes, who was a very, very capable bureaucrat, but they had to jack his image up a little bit. So Bernays comes up with this idea of hey, why don't I bring in all the stars of the day into the Rose Garden, the Oval Office or whatever, and you can hobnob with these people, and by a process of association with Al Jolson or Judy Garland or whoever the hell he got, we can give you a personality through associating you with these other people. This whole idea, so that there's this whole, we see this kind of birth of celebrities being on the same level as dignitaries. It's this stage is being set for what Debord will call the cult of the celebrity. Up to including the total psychotic, this psychotic political system that we now find ourselves in. We're literally, and it starts with Reagan, Ronald Reagan. We literally start voting for celebrities, to run the country. That we start to make this connection in our head that somehow, it's all one thing to us or to the mass of people. It's how did Trump get elected? You know, how did he get elected after everything was said and done? What was the deciding cultural vote and all of that? You know, it's like, I don't think that, I think that the fact of the matter is that he was a television star. You know, and most people, decisions were predicated on the fact that he had been on TV. He had been on TV. So this has an old history, and it hasn't stopped. The madness hasn't stopped, you know. Curtis will talk about, this is like during the war, right? It's like everything becomes like, and during the economic collapses at that time, Freud goes bankrupt. Freud will go bankrupt. You know, he's probably a well-off practicing Viennese clinician at the time. Who a lot of people aren't reading his book. So what does Bernays do? Bernays, in order to kind of help his Uncle Sigmund out financially, takes all of his books, you know, and starts to promote them in America. Starts this huge promotion campaign so that Freud and his work at this point become a household word. You know, it sends the money back to the old man. Sends the money back to the old man. Because he's good at it, you know. So that this whole aspect of like, it begs the question of how influential Freud's work would have been if this incredible public relations mechanism hadn't, like, people were ripe for Freud. People were ripe for his ideas. Because you got to remember that, and Curtis even talks about it, initially, Freud's ideas were considered scandalous. Scandalous in the sense that, you know, he was trying to say things about sexuality, you know, and the drives, and the sex drives, and the libido, and like stuff that no one had ever talked about. You know, no one had ever talked about any of this stuff in polite society before. And at first, the rest of the psychological community was kind of like, get that shit away from me, man. It's like, you know, we're all very prurient, and we don't talk about that kind of stuff. But people had an allure to it. You know, it had an allure to the ideas, his ideas on sexuality and all that had the kind of they were sexy. They were sexy, you know, in the most kind of academic kind of way, you know, so that, you know, he would become very, very well known in this country through a public relations maneuver. Is that not to say that in academic communities, Freud's idea? Freud was also, you know, giving him his due. He's a very, very significant intellectual who was prodigious in coming up with a lot. It's like Freud wasn't entirely wrong. It's like I say in the lectures on psychoanalysis. Freud wasn't entirely wrong either. You know, he wasn't just some crackpot. You know, we'll see some crackpots later on in this series. You know. Curtis will go on. Walter Lippmann was a famous political writer at the time. He would have kind of been like whoever, the Matt Taibbi of his time, whatever. But he said to many that now we're in this now it's like it was becoming more and more apparent that Freud's ideas might have some weight, or at least it was sold as such. You know, that we needed that man as such, man as a species was inherently irrational and prone to violence and destruction, and that, you know, somebody as well placed as Walter Lippmann will write, to many this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. He'll say that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy up to this time, predicated on all of this political theory, you know, that will always be contentious, but, you know, kind of starts with guys like Rousseau and Voltaire, and the guys that the founding fathers of our country, you know, like this whole Jeffersonian idea of man as, you know, as being, you know, an image of God, you know, it's like divine, you know, these divine ideas of equality and that We are all equal. It's like all of these ideas start getting contested due to Bernays' kind of hitting people over the head with this fairly negative reading of the human being via his uncle. To many, this meant that one of the guiding principles of mass democracy was wrong. The belief that human beings could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. This becomes contested, right? So what's the flip side of that? The flip side of that is this. It's like, I'll say, the leading political writer Walter Lippmann argued that if in reality human beings were driven by unconscious irrational forces, then it was necessary to rethink democracy, rethink the tenets of representative democracy, and the ways in which democracy starts to get shifted in the body politic are predicated on these ideas that the masses can't be trusted, they needed to be babysitted, and most importantly, and most injuriously, they have to be told the difference between right and wrong. They need to be told what to do, often by force, all right, to have any kind of stability. So what gains ascendancy is this fairly negative version of not only the human being, but then this negative version of politics itself as being, a system to control people, of being a system to get them to do what you want them to do, during both peacetime and during wartime, so that this whole concept comes about of the engineering of consent. The engineering of consent, that this whole system of propaganda and news and manipulating the masses will be to get them to do what you need them to do in order to control them. All right? For on the political side, it becomes a question of how do we control them, and it's like, and how do we kind of flip the switch? How do we keep them docile and quiescent by giving them stuff and giving them little trinkets to, it's like, the old fable of, going to a far off land and giving the savages things to play with before you enslave them. Like mirrors and flash, giving them something to distract them. But then, in times of war, when you need them to be docile, you got to keep them, distracted. When you need them to go and, go get killed to support your interests that are being infringed on somewhere else, you've got to do a different maneuver with them. You got to sell them on a different maneuver. All right, because now you got to use them as cannon fodder to go fight for your interests someplace else. So that it's this kind of dance. It's this dance that goes on. I'm going to end with this for now. There's a lot more to go over in this episode, I know. But then Herbert Hoover becomes the president. All right, right before. He'll be the president that's in office, not unlike Trump. It's like he will be the president that will be in office when the stock market crashes. All right, he'll be the president, and things go, and in 1929 when the American economy goes shit can. All right, but before that, everything is going good. All right, before 1929, everything is going good. We've kind of got out of the war. With a minimal amount of, we had our losses, but we didn't have the carnage that happened in Germany and in France and all that. So it's so we're doing pretty good. So Hoover, this is a quote from Hoover, and he's talking to the advertising executives. He's talking to the Don, what's his name? He's talking to the madmen of his day. The show Mad Men, the executives. The ad executives. He's saying, you guys, you advertising guys, have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines. Machines that would become the key to economic progress. You know, it's literally gets said, you know. So everything's going good. Everything's going good. Everything's rational. You know, everything is going the way it's supposed to go. And I'm going to end on this. You know, and this goes back to, you know, our ideas about what constituted the market. You know, it's like people are buying stuff, the market. Everybody's kind of operating. Here's the thing, all right, and this is ultimately instructive. You know, if you want to understand the idea that, you know, basically the guiding human idea at this point is of a selfish person who wants to buy a lot of stuff to feed their sense of self-expression, all right, and feed the ego with a lot of luxury items. Folks, this is translating up, all right, this whole way of wanting to be the king. You know, everyone wants to be the king. You know, this will translate into the stock market, all right? So that all of a sudden, all these guys, all these traders, not traders like Benedict Arnold, traders like stock traders, they're all about like, it's like all of a sudden there's this thing that is called over-speculation and all this kind of rapacious buying and selling of things that don't really exist at that point, all right? And it's the same kind of like frenzy, it's the same kind of psychology that will like fuel and implode the 2008 crash, all right? But this overarching philosophy, you know, of getting what you want when you want it will ultimately cause the crash of the market in 1929. But they won't see it that way, you know, and they will go through, you know, and after 1929, look, it's like people closing up shop. They will go through a desert not unlike the one that has started for us. Not unlike the one that has started for us. That came about from the same kind of philosophies. We'll get into this more, you know, but it becomes very, very, very instructive, my friends, to compare the social, economic, and political climate that caused that crash. And, okay, they're different. They're different animals, all right? The pandemic is a different animal, but we have to understand the results. That the conditions themselves, whether it was caused by over-speculation in the 1929 crash or a pandemic in 2020, what's the end result, all right? And how are they going to deal with it? Because there's a lot of different ways they can, and we're going to talk about that next time, all right? So in the meantime, let's like get our proposal, let's like come up with some ideas about what you want to do for your final project, get them out to me, let me put my stamp of approval on them, watch the other 2 episodes. We're going to get more into this in the next lecture. And I'm going to have that out by, what's today, Tuesday? I'll have it out by Friday. So, okie doke.